Chapter 5 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. From the Peace of Bretigny to the renewal of the French War, England under Edward III, the Spanish War, 1360 to 1369. The Peace of Bretigny forms the high water mark of King Edward's prosperity. He had still 17 years to reign, but they were to be a period of growing troubles and gradual decline, corresponding to the decay of the king's own vigour and health. In 1360 Edward had reached the age of 48, but he was already beginning to show signs of the wear and tear of his busy life. Men grew old ere their time in those hard days. He was now the father of a very large family. He had 11 children, of whom 5 sons and 3 daughters survived. One of his main desires was to strengthen the crown by marrying his sons to the heiresses of the great baronial families, so as to concentrate as much of the feudal strength of England as he could in the hands of the royal family. His eldest son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, had reached the age of 30 before he entered into wedlock. He chose as his wife a lady of his own age, his cousin, Joanna, Countess of Kent, who inherited the estates of her father, Earl Edmund, the victim of Mortimer. She was a widow, having previously married Sir John Holland, by whom she had 2 sons destined to be prominent figures in the next reign. The Black Prince's marriage seems to have been one of inclination. His wife had been known as the Fair Maid of Kent, and all authorities unite to sing her praises. The matches into which his younger brothers entered seem to have been of their father's making rather than their own. Several of them were wedded before they were well out of boyhood. Lionel, the second surviving son of the king, was married to Elizabeth de Burgh, the greatest heiress in Ireland, who held in her own right the county of Ulster. After her early death he espoused as his second wife Yolande Visconti, daughter of the Lord of Milan. John of Gaunt, the next brother, made the most wealthy match of the whole family. When only 19, he married Blanche of Lancaster, the heiress of Henry of Lancaster, the victor of Cadzant and Auberoche. She was in her own right Countess of Lancaster, Derby, Lincoln, and Leicester, and the estates which she brought to her husband were the broadest heritage in England. Edmund of Langley, the 4th surviving son of Edward III, married as his first wife a Spanish princess, as his second his eldest brother's stepdaughter, Joanna Holland. Lastly, Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest of the princes, obtained as his bride Eleanor Bohun, one of the 2 co-heiresses of the ancient earldom of Hereford. At different times Edward conferred on each of his sons the title of Duke, a dignity hitherto unknown in England. The Prince of Wales was made Duke of Cornwall, Lionel Duke of Clarence, John Duke of Lancaster, Edmund Duke of York, and Thomas Duke of Gloucester. Of the 3 daughters of Edward III who reached adult years, Mary married John V, the Montfort claimant to the Duchy of Brittany. Margaret was wedded to John Hastings, Earl of Pembroke, and Isabella to Ingelram de Coucy, a French baron who served her father as a great captain of mercenaries. He was created Earl of Bedford. During Edward's own lifetime, the concentration of so many of the richest fiefs in the hands of his sons undoubtedly strengthened the crown and enfeebled the baronage to a corresponding extent. But he does not seem to have reflected that he was leaving an unenviable future to his successor, destined to have to deal with uncles and cousins who were not only very powerful territorial nobles, but also princes of the blood, with possible claims on the crown. In endowing his younger sons with such enormous power, he was contributing his part toward making the Wars of the Roses possible. It was the excessive strength of the House of Lancaster which proved the ruin of Richard II., and in a later generation it was the over-greatness of the heir of the united lines of York, Clarence, and Mortimer which brought down the house of Lancaster to its bloody end. Edward does not seem in the least to have foreseen that though his own sons would obey and support him, the patriarch of their race, yet his grandsons would have no such feelings of loyalty to his eldest son's heir. Meanwhile, these dangers were still in the far future, and Edward seemed in 1360 the most successful sovereign of his age. His fame as a soldier was spread all over Europe, and the English, who before his time enjoyed no special military repute, became the models of all Western Christendom. The soldiers trained in his wars, Sir John Chandos, Knowles, Manny, Thomas, and William Felton, and the Gascon Jean de Grailly, the Captal de Buch, were reckoned the best knights of their day. Sir John Hawkwood, who had risen from the ranks to become a captain of adventurers, passed on into Italy with his band, and carried the balance of power in the peninsula with him, as he served one state or another with the famous White Company. This ascendancy of the English in the field implied the predominance of infantry as the chief power in war, to the detriment of the feudal chivalry which had ruled Europe for the last 5 centuries. In the new system, whose first victories had been seen at Duplin and Halidon Hill, the knights descended from their steeds and formed a solid centre of resistance, while the yeomen with their deadly archery took the more active share in the repulse of the hostile attack. Edward III must have the credit of applying this order of battle, which had originally been devised against the Scottish spearmen, to the discomfiture of the French feudal horse. The effect of Crécy and Poitiers was so great that the art of war in Western Europe was wholly revolutionized, and the French, Germans, and Italians took to dismounting and fighting on foot like the English. This loss of military ascendancy by the noblesse was still further developed by another military change of the 14th century. Firearms, whose feeble beginnings go back to the first decade of Edward's reign, were slowly improving and coming into more general use all through the succeeding generation. Though their size was still small and their discharge slow, they proved almost as deadly to the feudal castle as the yeoman's arrow had been to the feudal horseman. It began to be possible to breach by the use of cannon strongholds which had hitherto been reckoned impregnable. This gave the king, the only person in the realm who possessed a competent train of artillery, an advantage in dealing with unruly barons such as he had never before enjoyed. Rebels could no longer rely on holding out behind their walls for many months, nor count starvation the only form of attack that they need dread. But the power of cannon to break up feudalism was only just beginning to be realized in the later days of Edward III. It was not fully developed till the 15th century. Edward III did almost as much to advance the growth of English trade and commerce as to increase English military prestige. But his work in this province was not wholly intentional. When encouraging close commercial intercourse with Flanders, he was thinking mainly of the political advantages of the connection with the Flemings, and also hoped to draw financial profits from the taxes on increased exports and imports. But there can be no doubt that his Netherlandish and German alliances took Englishmen further afield than they had been wont to go before, and had favourable results on the national trade. Its volume increased so rapidly during the reign that Edward, first of all English kings, was able to introduce a gold currency into the realm. Before his time, the silver penny had been the largest monetary unit, but he succeeded in issuing with general approval a large gold coin called the Rose Noble, one of which exchanged for 80 pence. This broad, handsome piece secured such general acceptance that it circulated freely in the Netherlands and Western Germany, and many of the lords and towns of the Low Countries took to striking money exactly imitating the noble in type and size. This extension of the English currency is closely connected with the fact that from the time of Edward III onward, the English were beginning to send their own merchants abroad, and no longer were content to receive all continental goods at the home ports from foreign ships. Down to the 14th century, the greater part of the seaborne merchandise which England consumed was brought her by the Italians or the traders of the Hanseatic League. Edward very properly encouraged his subjects to sail abroad themselves, so as to get rid of the middleman and the charges which he exacted for transporting commodities to England. To compete with the powerful foreign trading societies, the native merchants were bound together in the Company of the Staple, whose institution we have already had occasion to notice. Though monopolies are generally harmful, yet in this case it was almost necessary to secure strength by combination, as the individual trader would have been helpless if he tried to oppose himself to the interests of the corporations of aliens whose markets he was invading. By the end of the century the limits of English seafaring trade were Lisbon and Hamburg. Into the Mediterranean it did not yet penetrate, and the Baltic was almost entirely in the hands of the zealous Hanseatic League. But Chaucer's typical shipman, as it will be remembered, knew all havens, from Gothland to the Cape of Finisterre, that is, from northwestern Spain to the coast of Sweden. Manufactures were developing no less than trade. King Edward never did a wiser deed than when he invited the Flemish weavers to settle in Norwich and make up on the spot the fine English wool which used formerly to be taken over to the Netherlands in order to be woven into cloth. In the true protectionist spirit, a law of 1337 prohibited the wearing of any but English cloth by all persons save the royal family. Weaving was not the only craft which took a new start in the 14th century from the introduction of foreign teachers. Metal work was much improved, and the use of glass in domestic architecture grew much more common. The influence of the Black Death on trade and prices deserves notice. It not only raised the wages of the agricultural classes, in despite of the statute of labourers, but increased the selling value of all manufactured goods. While corn and other natural products of the soil remained at their old level of price, and while sheep and oxen rose only slightly in value, all the things produced by skilled manual labour cost from 40 to 60% more than they did before the Great Plague. This came, of course, from the fact that the artisans had been seriously reduced in numbers, so that the survivors were able to demand much higher prices for their handiwork. Since the cost of food remained the same as it had been before, the labouring classes were able to buy it of better quality and in greater quantity than of old, and their standard of comfort appreciably went up. The merchant profited as much or more from the enhanced selling value of his wares as he lost through having to pay higher wages to the artisans who manufactured them. On the other hand, the capitalist landowner was in a worse position than in the days before the Black Death, since his farm produce cost more in the item of labour, and yet sold for much the same money that it had in the first half of the century. Hence two tendencies had their rise: the landowner who had been wont to cultivate a large part of his estate himself as a home farm under a bailiff, in demesne, as the term then was, either abandoned the practice and let the demesne land at a rent to tenant farmers, or tried to turn his arable fields into pasture. For a greater profit was to be had from rearing sheep for their wool, the great staple product of England, than by growing any sort of corn. These changes, however, were only beginning to make themselves felt in King Edward's time. It takes many years to turn a simple race of conservative habits into new methods of life and husbandry. The actual loss of population by the Black Death took many generations to repair. It seems to have been felt far more in some districts than in others. The southern and eastern counties suffered more in proportion than the western, and probably lost in consequence somewhat of the enormous superiority in wealth and importance which they had hitherto possessed. They still remained, however, the preponderant part of the realm. 9 years were destined to elapse between the conclusion of the Treaty of Bretigny and the renewal of the war with France. They were, on the whole, a time of peace and prosperity for England, and as is generally the case during such periods, there is little of importance to record in the domestic annals during their course. The intermittent quarrel with the Papacy, which had been going on for many years, caused the renewal of the Statute of Provisors and the confirmation of a Statute of Praemunire, so called, because by it persons who took appeals to the Pope at Avignon were warned beforehand, praemuniti, that they made themselves liable to be brought before the king's courts for showing contempt of his exclusive right of jurisdiction in England, 1365. The writs against such offenders began with the words praemunire facias, and hence came the name of the statute. Some curious legislation against the wearing of clothing too good for their condition by the lower and middle classes bears witness to their growth and prosperity since the Black Death. Like all sumptuary laws, it had no effect and had soon to be abandoned. It is perhaps worth noting also that in 1362 English was made the official language of the law courts, where Norman French had hitherto prevailed. The foreign affairs of the realm are of more importance, and from the first made it evident that the Treaty of Bretigny was to be a truce and not a permanent pacification. Its terms were never fully carried out. King John failed to raise his enormous ransom, and when he found that it could not be collected, loyally returned to England and surrendered his person, since he had failed to keep his promise. He died at the Palace of the Savoy in the Strand on April 8, 1364. When he had passed away, his son Charles V, a very crafty and unscrupulous prince, refused to listen to any complaints as to the non-observance of the treaty. But he was as yet too busy in pacifying his own realm to stir against the English. He was not even firmly set upon the throne till the claims of his turbulent cousin, Charles the Bad of Navarre, were crushed by the defeat of Cocherel and disposed of by a treaty signed in May 1365. The Breton War of Succession, which had been raging ever since 1341, at last reached its termination in 1364. The younger John of Montfort, the ally of the English, at last succeeded in winning complete possession of his duchy by slaying his rival, Charles of Blois, at the Battle of Auray, a fight gained by the valour and tactical skill of Sir John Chandos and the other English knights who served under his banner, September 29th, 1364. But another war in which England was interested was to lead to less happy results. It was the work of Edward the Black Prince, who had been ruling in Aquitaine almost as an independent prince since his father handed it over to him and gave him the ducal title in 1362. To his court at Bordeaux there came as a suppliant an exiled Spanish prince, Pedro, King of Castile, whom his subjects surnamed the Cruel. He was a stern and high-handed prince whose harsh and wicked rule — he had murdered his wife and one of his half-brothers among countless other victims — had driven the Castilians into revolt. The insurrection had been headed by his bastard brother, Henry, Count of Trastamara, who had called into his aid a great host of French mercenaries led by Bertrand de Guislin, a famous Breton captain of adventurers. Henry, with the help of these allies, easily expelled Pedro from his realm and had himself crowned as king, 1366. The exile urged on the Black Prince that his situation in Aquitaine would be perilous if he let the neighbouring Spanish lands pass under the control of a dependent of the French. He promised to repay all the expenses of the war if Edward would restore him to his throne, and to bind himself the closer to the English, offered to leave his two daughters, Constance and Isabel, in the Black Prince's hands as hostages. After some hesitation, Edward resolved to give the king his aid. The political advantages of the move influenced him much, but he was moved even more by a chivalrous impulse. He hated the idea of turning away a suppliant, and loving war for its own sake, he was burning to add new laurels to those of Poitiers and Espagnol-sur-Mer. Accordingly, he accepted Pedro's offer, and the nobles of Aquitaine were bidden to prepare for a Spanish war in the next spring. John of Gaunt brought over a small contingent from England, but the bulk of the army of invasion was made up of the Gascon noblesse and the veteran mercenaries who flocked in from all quarters to join the prince's banner. So great was his warlike fame in Europe that more adventurers came to proffer him their aid than he could possibly pay or feed. He had to send away thousands of them, after having picked out the best of the men-at-arms to serve him. Thus his army was composed of none but the choice troops, and far exceeded in military value the Spanish feudal levies against which it was to be pitted. Edward crossed the Pyrenees by the pass of Roncesvalles, famous in history and in song for the defeat of the Emperor Charles the Great in 778, and for the death of Count Roland, the hero of the oldest legend of chivalry. Charles the Bad gave him a free passage through Navarre, and he did not see the enemy till he reached the hills above Vitoria, where Wellington was to win the crowning victory of the Peninsular War 4.5 centuries later. Henry of Trastamara and his French allies had raised a great host, which blocked the passes over the hills of Alava. But the prince outgeneralled them, slipped round their flank, and crossed the Ebro, entering Old Castile. The Spaniards hurried back to place themselves between Edward's host and Burgos, the capital of the realm. The shock between the two armies took place in a broad level plain between the towns of Najera and Navarrete. The result was never for a moment doubtful. Though the Castilians were somewhat superior in numbers, they were mostly raw troops. Moreover, they were accustomed to the skirmishing tactics of the Moors, not to facing the embattled line of dismounted men-at-arms flanked by archery. The great masses of light horsemen, armed with buckler and javelin, which formed the most numerous part of Don Henry's host, broke and fled away in utmost rout a few minutes after they came under the deadly shower of arrows. The French auxiliaries, who had sent away their horses and fought on foot as at Poitiers, were surrounded and slain or captured to the last man. The bastard, who had tried in vain to rally his scattered horsemen, fled away in haste and escaped into France, April 3rd, 1367. Thus Dom Pedro recovered his kingdom at a single blow. He celebrated the victory by beheading such of the prisoners as fell into his hands, to the utter disgust of his chivalrous ally. Edward marched with him as far as Burgos, and replaced him in his palace, but dissensions at once began between them. Pedro could not or would not repay the vast sums which the prince had spent in raising and paying his army. The English hosts were kept cantoned round Burgos all through the summer, suffering severely from the unaccustomed heat and from a lack of supplies. Sickness broke out among them, and Edward himself was prostrated by an attack of fever. Meanwhile the Castilian king had gone away to Andalusia, and sent evasive letters instead of remittances of money. At last the prince, in high disgust, marched back unpaid to Aquitaine, leaving his faithless ally to shift for himself. By displaying again his old cruelty and recklessness, Pedro soon provoked a second rebellion of his subjects. Henry of Trastamara returned, defeated him in battle, and finally took him prisoner. The bastard then settled the succession question by brutally murdering his brother with his own hands, March 1369. Thus the only result of the victory of Navarrete was that an implacable enemy of England was now firmly set upon the Castilian throne, while the Duchy of Aquitaine was overwhelmed with the enormous debt incurred in restoring Dom Pedro. The prince, honestly desiring to pay what he owed, sold his silver plate, surrendered to his followers the ransoms of his French and Castilian prisoners, and tried to make up the balance by raising money from his subjects. But his proposal to impose on every house in Aquitaine a hearth tax of 1 franc provoked bitter opposition. The Poitevins and other newly annexed vassals of the duchy were thoroughly discontented and disloyal, and took the first opportunity of withstanding their master. The estates of Aquitaine refused to vote the impost, and when Edward persevered in his plan, a body of barons, headed by the lords of Albret and Armagnac, announced their intention of appealing to the king at Paris. This was utterly contrary to the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny, by which Aquitaine had been freed for ever from all feudal dependence on the French crown. The Gascon nobles, therefore, had no right to call in Charles V., but legality counted for little, and the one point of importance was to discover whether the king would dare to involve himself in a new English war after the unhappy experiences of his father and grandfather. Charles V. resolved to take the risk. He had got his realm into something like order during the 5 years which had elapsed since he had crushed the King of Navarre, and he was well acquainted with the fact that more than half of Edward's subjects in Aquitaine were ready to rebel and join him. Accordingly, he first sent a summons to the Black Prince to appear at Paris and answer before his suzerain for wrongs done to the barons of the south, and when this preposterous order was ignored, commenced hostilities. It is said that as a mark of contempt he sent the final declaration of war, not by a herald, as was the custom, but by the hands of his master cook. April 29th, 1369. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The last years of Edward III, 1369 to 1377, the loss of Aquitaine, domestic troubles, rise of the Wycliffites. From the very first moment of the outbreak of war, the struggle with France proved disastrous for England. Almost before the designs of Charles V were realized, news came that the isolated county of Ponthieu had been overrun by the enemy, and that Abbeville and its other towns and castles had surrendered. The state of affairs in Aquitaine was not much better. In many parts of Poitou, Périgord, and Rouergue, powerful barons disavowed their allegiance and took up arms in behalf of the French king. In the war which followed, the English lacked the advantage which they had enjoyed in the earlier struggle of being guided by a single leader. King Edward never again took the field, though only in his 58th year. He was worn out as much in mind as in body. The direction of affairs ought to have passed to his eldest son, a man in the prime of life, verging on his 40th year. But the Black Prince had never recovered from the effects of the fever which had stricken him down during his Spanish campaign. For the rest of his life he was a confirmed invalid, and every exertion which he made was immediately followed by a relapse which sent him back to his sick bed. For the first 2 years of the war he endeavoured to stay at the helm, but the want of vigour and combination which attended the movements of the English troops showed that he was not himself. When he finally was obliged to retire from the scene of action in 1370, the main part of the responsibility fell to his next surviving brother, John of Gaunt, a busy and ambitious but not a capable prince. He had made many enemies and was never able to command the same unhesitating obedience which had been shown to Edward III and the Black Prince. As long as the younger Edward still kept his court at Bordeaux, the English continued to defend Aquitaine with moderate success. But Sir John Chandos, the prince's right-hand man, was killed in a petty skirmish in Poitou on December 31st, 1369, and after his death things took a turn for the worse. In 1370 the French struck deep into the Duchy of Aquitaine and captured first the strong town of Aiguillon in Agenois, and then the important city of Limoges, whose citizens treacherously opened their gates to the invaders. The prince took the field for the last time to recover Limoges, though he was so weak that he could not sit his war horse and had to be borne on a litter. He took the place after an obstinate defence by throwing down part of the wall by a mine filled with gunpowder. When his men entered the breach, he bade them cut down everyone they met, for he was much enraged with his rebellious subjects. Thus his hitherto spotless career was sullied by a massacre in its last moments, October 1370. 3 months later his health grew so much worse that he took ship for England, expecting every moment to be his last. But he survived the passage and lingered on for more than 5 years at his castle of Berkhamsted, a helpless invalid, unable to take any part either in war or domestic governance. With the departure of the prince, things in France went from bad to worse. The French could not be kept back from overrunning Aquitaine, though 2 considerable expeditions had been sent out from Calais to endeavour to distract them from their prey. But by the orders of their king, the nobles of northern France utterly refused battle, shut themselves up in their castles, and allowed the English to march past them unmolested. These unchivalrous but effective tactics caused John of Gaunt in 1369 and Sir Robert Knowles in 1370 to march across Picardy without effecting anything of note, for they had no leisure to engage in sieges, and they could not get the battle that they desired. But in 1372 England made a serious effort to reinforce Aquitaine. The Parliament had granted the king a subsidy of £50,000, and with it a considerable army and fleet were collected and placed under the orders of John, Earl of Pembroke, the king's son-in-law. He crossed the Bay of Biscay safely, but as he drew near La Rochelle, the port for which he was aiming, found his path beset by a large Spanish fleet. Henry of Trastamara was bent on revenging Navarrete, and he had just found another reason for taking strong measures against the English. John of Gaunt and his younger brother, Edmund of Langley, had in the winter of 1371 and 72 wedded the 2 daughters and heiresses of Pedro the Cruel, who had been dwelling as hostages at Bordeaux ever since their father broke his word in 1367. In virtue of this marriage, John gave himself out as the rightful king of Castile. Henry was much enraged, and had sent forth to aid the French all the ships that he could gather together. A fierce fight ensued off La Rochelle, in which the English were totally defeated, many of their light vessels being sunk by the great stones and masses of iron which the Biscayans cast down into them from their taller ships, June 22nd, 1372. Pembroke and many scores of knights were taken prisoners. The defence of Aquitaine, now that the army of succour had been destroyed, fell upon the shoulders of the Captal de Buch, the loyal Gascon baron who had so much distinguished himself at Poitiers 16 years before. He made a gallant fight, but was utterly unable to stem the advancing flood of French invasion. His forces were too small, and the discontented people of the land would give him no help. Poitiers, Niort, and La Rochelle fell into the hands of the enemy, betrayed by their citizens, and with them went almost the whole of Poitou, Saintonge, and Agoumois. At last the Captal was surprised and taken prisoner in a skirmish near Soubise, and with him departed the last hope of maintaining the English dominion north of the Garonne. About the same time, John V. of Brittany, the one faithful ally of King Edward, saw the greater part of his duchy overrun by the French, whose forces were led by his own born subject, the great condottiere Bertrand de Guisclin, who had now been made Constable of France, 1372 to 1373. In 1373 England made her last effort to turn the fortune of war. John of Gaunt was sent over the water with 3,000 men-at-arms and 6,000 bowmen. At Calais he was joined by a great body of mercenaries raised in the Netherlands and Germany. We hear to our surprise that he had even enlisted 300 Scottish lances to serve against the French. Thus a formidable army was mustered, but it was led by an incompetent general, and was directed on the wrong lines. It would have been better to start from Bordeaux and clear Périgord and Saintonge of the enemy, instead of starting on a mere destructive raid into northern France. The experience of 1369 and 1370 had already shown that such operations had no effect against a king like Charles V., who did not intend to fight, and could not be stirred to indiscretion even by seeing the barns and cottages of his subjects blazing up on every side. John of Gaunt was allowed to push his way across Picardy and Champagne as far as the Loire. The French hung about his route and cut off his stragglers, but would not offer battle. Then he moved on into Berry and went on ravaging the land on his way to Bordeaux. The autumn had now set in, and among the rugged mountains of Auvergne the army suffered terrible privations. Nearly all the horses died of starvation, and many men fell by the way from cold and over-fatigue. At last they reached Bordeaux, ragged and famished, after having accomplished no useful end whatever. They had inflicted untold misery on the peasantry of central France, but had brought no pressure to bear on Charles V, nor even retaken one of the lost towns of northern Aquitaine. In April 1374, Lancaster disbanded the remnants of his hosts, since he could no longer pay them, and returned to England. The failure of his ill-managed expedition was followed by the loss of the greater part of Guienne and Gascony. The inhabitants felt that the King of England's last bolt was shot, and that there was no object in fighting any longer for a lost cause. One after another, all the towns along the Garonne and Dordogne gave themselves up to the French, after feeble and perfunctory resistances. By the end of 1374, all that was left to King Edward were the cities of Bordeaux and Bayonne, and the narrow slip of Gascon coastland connecting them. All the inland was gone. That the two great seaports still held out was mainly due to the fact that their trading interests were closely bound up with the English connection, and that they knew that they were getting better and more orderly government from their actual lord than would be granted them by Charles V. It must be remembered, too, that they had been in the hands of the Plantagenets ever since Henry II had married Eleanor of Aquitaine 200 years before, and had no historical or sentimental ties with the House of Valois. Considering the utter ruin of the English cause in Aquitaine, Edward III must be considered to have been fortunate when, in the June of the following year, 1375, he succeeded in concluding a suspension of hostilities with the enemy. The truce was for a year, but it was renewed for a second 12th month in June of 1376, and actually lasted for the whole of the short remainder of the old king's reign. The 5 years during which Aquitaine was gradually passing into the hands of the French were very important in the constitutional history of England. All through their course a bitter struggle was going on in Parliament, caused by the discontent of the nation at the unfortunate issue of the war. Its first sign was an outbreak against the king's ministers in 1371. It was easy to attribute the successes of the French to the incapacity of the men whom the king had chosen to carry on the administration. Of these, the most important were 2 prelates, William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, the Chancellor, and Thomas of Branningham, Bishop of Exeter, the Treasurer. Both were able and disinterested men. Wykeham, who had first attracted Edward's attention by his skill as an architect, had been found an honest and capable statesman, and has left a good name behind him as the founder of Winchester College, the first great public school, and of the sister foundation of New College, Oxford. It was wholly unjust to lay the blame of the losses in Aquitaine on the Chancellor and Treasurer. They were really due to military causes. The want of a single competent general-in-chief, and the squandering of men and money on the unwise raids into northern France. But the Parliament attributed them to the incapacity of the ecclesiastics to rule in time of war, and petitioned the king to dismiss them, and to replace them by laymen. Edward yielded, and Sir Robert Thorpe was made Chancellor, while Sir Richard Scrope, a follower of John of Gaunt, took over the charge of the Treasury. The new administration proved far more unfortunate than that which it had supplanted. John of Gaunt had now become the true ruling power in the realm. His elder brother was on his sick bed, and his father was falling into his dotage. Edward III had lost his wise and faithful wife, Philippa of Hainault, in 1369, and shortly after fell into the hands of a worthless adventuress, Dame Alice Perrers. In his foolish fondness for her, he allowed her to tamper with matters of state, and all who wished to advance themselves about the court came to her with bribes. She even contrived to interfere with the administration of justice, and to frighten or corrupt the judges. John of Gaunt left his father in the hands of this harpy, and assumed complete control of foreign affairs. It was on him that the responsibility for the disasters of 1373, 4, and 5 must be laid. After the loss of Guyenne, he was forced to face Parliament with a lamentable report of money wasted, opportunities let slip, and provinces lost to the French. On the meeting of the Good Parliament of 1376, the storm of national discontent, which had been brewing for the last 3 years, burst upon Lancaster's head. He was accused, justly enough, of incapacity, but men added unfounded accusations, such as the charge of plotting to seize the throne at his father's death, to the exclusion of his invalid brother, and of the little Prince Richard the Black Prince's 9-year-old son. It was even whispered that he had planned to get the boy poisoned. John himself was too highly placed for the Parliament to dare to attack him openly, but a vigorous assault was made on his friends and associates. Peter de la Mare, the Speaker of the House of Commons, boldly declared that the nation was ready to help the king in his distress, but that they must first remove from about his person those who were making their private profit out of his misfortunes. The 3 chief offenders pointed out were the Chamberlain, William Lord Latimer, Richard Lyons, the king's financial agent, and Dame Alice Perrers. The 2 first named had been guilty of disgraceful frauds. They had bought up the king's debts from poor men who despaired of ever seeing their money, at half their nominal amount or less, and then paid themselves in full from the treasury. On one occasion they had lent the king 20,000 marks, 13,333, 6 shillings 8 pence, and got out of him an acknowledgment for £20,000 sterling. Latimer had extorted a great bribe from the Duke of Brittany, England's faithful ally, and had then betrayed him by selling his castles of Saint-Sauveur and Becherel to the French. Latimer and Lyons were accordingly impeached, that is, formally accused by the Commons and tried by the House of Peers. The Lords found them guilty, and they were sentenced to be fined, imprisoned, and deprived of their offices. Several minor offenders were punished at the same time. As to Dame Alice, the Commons accused her of breaking the law which forbade women to meddle with the administration of justice, and obtained against her an award of banishment. She was made to swear that she would never return to the king's presence, an oath which she very soon broke. While these trials were in progress, the Prince of Wales died, June 8th, 1376. Parliament petitioned the king that his little grandson Richard should be at once recognized as heir to the crown, and that a standing council should be appointed to carry on the government. Edward himself was no longer capable of work, and it was felt that John of Gaunt must be prevented from engrossing all the royal powers into his hands. Accordingly, the king consented that Parliament should nominate 9 persons as members of the council, of whom at least 4 were to be always about his person. At the same time, he promised to consider favourably the demands contained in a vast list of 140 petitions dealing with all manner of administrative grievances, which the Commons laid before him. 2 of the most important of these documents demanded, the one that Parliaments should be annual, the other that the sheriffs and other royal officers should not interfere with the election of knights of the shire, but always allow the return of the persons whom the better folk of the county should nominate. On the 6th of July the Parliament dispersed, having, as it fondly supposed, crushed Lancaster, and provided for the future good governance of the realm. The moment that they had broken up, John of Gaunt took his revenge and executed a kind of coup d'état. He got his doting father into his hands, and then used his name to declare that the Good Parliament had been no Parliament at all, and that its acts were null and void. He threw the late Speaker, Peter de la Mare, into prison, dismissed the 9 newly appointed councillors, and released Lyons and the other culprits who had been condemned. Alice Perrers was allowed quietly to return to court. A new Parliament was then summoned to meet, and by employing the royal prerogative in the most unscrupulous fashion, and threatening and overawing the electors, Lancaster succeeded in getting returned a large majority of his supporters (January 1377). The king had now entered into the 50th year of his reign, and to celebrate his jubilee proclaimed a pardon and an amnesty to many minor offenders and debtors. At the head of the list, however, appeared the names of Latimer and Lyons and their underlings, who were relieved of all fines, penalties, and disabilities which had been laid upon them in the previous year. All these actions were scandalous and highly calculated to lead to civil war. If the party which opposed the Duke and the court had been headed by a baronial chief of the type of Simon de Montfort, or of the great earls who had withstood Edward I, it is probable that Lancaster would have been overthrown by force of arms. But this was far from being the case. The most prominent leader of the constitutional party was Bishop William of Wykeham, a lover of peace and caution, and the chief lay patron of the cause, the young Earl of March, was also a man of moderate views. No open opposition to Duke John was made at first, even when he proceeded to bring against Wykeham a ridiculous charge of embezzling public funds as a kind of counterblast to the impeachment of Latimer and Lyons in the preceding year. Lancaster, though a short-sighted politician, was yet conscious that he must soon be overthrown unless he could manage to enlist a certain amount of popular sympathy on his side. The truce with France being still running, he could not appeal to warlike sentiments, but there was one strong current of opinion which he thought that he might direct into channels favourable to himself. This was the anti-papal feeling, which was as strong now as in the days when the statutes of provisors and praemunire had been passed. The court of Avignon was going from bad to worse, and its shameless demands and exactions deeply irritated every patriotic Englishman. But a great part of the clergy now, as always, thought themselves bound to side with the papacy, and the English Church was itself full of abuses and scandals which did not tend to grow less. Bishops who neglected their dioceses and were more at home in war and diplomacy than in spiritual work had always existed, but in the 14th century their numbers were greater than ever, since the baronage had taken of late to putting their younger sons into the Church and pressing them forward for promotion. In earlier centuries this had been rare. In the 14th it was very common. 3 of the 7 archbishops of Canterbury between 1348 and 1400 were sons or brothers of peers. The average of episcopal piety and unworldliness was not improved by the change. Among the beneficed clergy there was a great deal of non-residence, an appreciable amount of simony, and a certain proportion of evil living. The abbeys and friaries were worse. All accounts agree that the monastic bodies were inferior to the secular priests in zeal and moral worth. It is said that the hasty filling up of the depleted ranks of the clergy with unqualified and unsatisfactory persons after the Black Death had a permanent effect in lowering the moral tone of the whole body. At the same time, the Church was richer than ever. It was believed that 1/3 of the land and wealth of the realm were in clerical hands. The clergy always gave liberal grants and convocation for national purposes, but this did not satisfy men who complained that their land escaped all feudal taxation, and so did not pay their fair share towards filling the treasury. The feeling that something ought to be done to improve the internal condition of the Church, as well as to check the encroachments of the Pope, had long been prevalent, and was shared by many who were themselves clerics. Among those who were foremost in calling for radical measures of reform was John Wycliffe, sometime master of Balliol College, a learned Oxford doctor of divinity. He had first made his mark as a deep thinker in philosophy and theology, but was driven into politics by his indignation at the corrupt state of the Church and the papacy. He came to the conclusion that most of the clerical scandals of the day had their roots in the overgreat wealth and power of the Church, and held that the best way to reform it would be to compel the clergy to return to the apostolic poverty of the early centuries. Against the papacy, as the source of all other evils, he was particularly keen. He had been first introduced to public affairs as a member of a deputation sent to Bruges in 1374 to negotiate terms of agreement between the English Church and the Pope. The evil impression which the papal delegates then made on him he never forgot. Ere long we find him protesting in the strongest terms against the spiritual authority which the Pope claimed to exercise over the whole Church, and asserting that it was blasphemous for him to pose as God's vice-regent on earth and the mediator between Christ and the individual Christian. All men, he said, employing a familiar metaphor drawn from the feudal system, are tenants in chief under God, responsible directly to him for their souls and their manner of life. The Pope is like an intruder who tries to push in as a mean tenant between God and man. Then he added that spiritual authority could only be wielded by a righteous man, and that no obedience was due to the orders of a spiritual ruler whose life was not in consonance with the word of Christ. Not only the Pope, but a large number of the English prelates might fairly be said to come under this condemnation. At a later date, Wycliffe added to his attack on the governors of the Church an attack on some of the characteristic doctrines of Rome, notably on that of transubstantiation in the Eucharist. This later development, however, had not begun in 1377, and it was only as preaching insubordination and resistance to Rome that Wycliffe was at this time arraigned and tried by Bishop Courtenay of London, a strong opponent of John of Gaunt. The Duke's only sympathy with Wycliffe came from the fact that they both desired to repress the overgrown power of the ecclesiastical authorities, the one from political and personal motives, the other on religious and theoretical grounds. With Wycliffe's spiritual fervour, Lancaster had nothing in common, but he resolved to support him because they owned the same enemies and because there was always popularity to be gained by opposing Rome. Accordingly, when Wycliffe was brought before the bishop in St. Paul's for trial, February 1377, the Duke came in person and threatened Courtenay in such stormy language that after an unseemly altercation the assembly broke up in disorder and Wycliffe went free. A mob of the bishop's friends and followers went next day and sacked John's palace of the Savoy. Though much enraged, he dared not proceed to more violent measures against Courtenay, and contented himself with making his father suspend for a time some of the privileges of the city of London. Thus the political strife of the court party and the constitutional party had become complicated with the religious dispute between the reformers and the Romanizers. How much further matters would have gone had John of Gaunt retained his unlimited power and authority we cannot say, for the aspect of affairs was wholly changed a few months later by the death of the old king. Edward died on June 2nd, 1377, at his palace of Sheen. When his last moments were near, his servants stole all they could and fled. The shameless Alice Perrers is said to have stripped the very rings from his hands when she saw him fall into unconsciousness. Of all the numerous train that he had fed, only one poor priest was present to minister the offices of the Church as he drew his last breath. This miserable deathbed was but the natural termination of a life spent in the pursuit of selfish pleasure and ambition. Such a king was bound to breed a race of heartless courtiers and thankless dependents. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Richard II. The Years of the Minority, 1377 to 1388. The accession to the throne of the late king's grandson, Richard II., a bright, promising lad of 11, put an end to the domination of John of Gaunt. The Princess of Wales and the friends of her deceased husband, who had brought up the young king, had never been allied to Lancaster and had viewed his movements with suspicion. He had no longer the power to use the royal name for his own profit as he had done for the last few years. Facing the situation with more wisdom than might have been expected, the Duke made no attempt to hold on to the helm, but yielded with a good grace, and entered into a formal reconciliation with Wickham and the other chiefs of the constitutional party. Peter Delamere was released from prison, the Londoners were pardoned for their riot of the preceding February, and it was agreed that old enmity should be forgotten. The governance of the realm was placed in the hands of a council in which both the parties were fairly represented. The first Parliament of the new reign passed two important pieces of constitutional legislation, one providing that during a minority the king's ministers should be chosen by the two houses, the other was to the effect that all acts passed by Parliament could be set aside only by the consent of Parliament. This second point was one which was not to be fully established for 300 years. As late as the time of James II, kings still claimed to have a dispensing power which overrode the statute book. Though the danger of domestic troubles was for a time at an end, the condition of politics was yet far from satisfactory. Charles V of France had refused to renew the truce which ran out in the summer of 1377, and the 100 Years' War had once more passed into an acute stage. The campaigns which followed were neither so disastrous nor so decisive as those of 1373-75, but their results were on the whole unfavourable. Nothing of importance was lost. The whole inland had already fallen into the hands of the French, and the grasp of the English on the coast towns was very firm, but on the other hand nothing was regained, and the expenses of the war were ruinous. In 1380 an expedition under the king's youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, landed at Calais and cut its way through Picardy, Champagne, and the Orleanois to Brittany. It was a mere repetition of Lancaster's march in 1373. Once more the French avoided open battle and contented themselves with defending their walled towns and cutting off the foragers and stragglers of the invading host. Earl Thomas reached Vannes without any overwhelming disaster, but with an army too much harassed and worn down to accomplish the delivery of Brittany from the French. John V, the faithful ally of England since his accession in 1345, was at last driven to abandon the alliance and make peace with the enemy. He was recognized as Duke by the French government in return for his submission, and at last recovered the whole of his dominions, 1380. The abortive expedition to Brittany had been very costly, and heavy taxation was necessary to pay the troops, whose wages were 6 months in arrear. Accordingly, the Chancellor, Simon of Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, laid before the Parliament of Northampton projects for the raising of a sum of £160,000. The method finally adopted for collecting it was a poll tax on the whole of the inhabitants of the realm above the age of 15. It was graduated upwards from 1 shilling paid by the poor to £3 imposed on the richest individuals. The imposition of this tax, which pressed very heavily on the labouring classes, was the cause of the explosion of a discontent which had been brewing ever since the social troubles that had followed the Black Death and the Statute of Labourers. The Peasant Revolt, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion, as it is sometimes called, was not the result of the poll tax only. That imposition, though bitterly resented, was but the occasion and not the cause of the rising, just as the greased cartridges in 1857 were not the cause of the Indian Mutiny. The origins of the trouble were many and varied much in different places. In London and the towns the discontent was largely political. The people resented the disastrous results of the French war and the heavy taxation which resulted from it. They laid the blame on the governing classes, without much distinction of persons and parties, save that John of Gaunt was especially singled out as responsible for the present unhappy situation. In the shires, on the other hand, the explosion was mainly the result of social causes, and especially of the grievances of villenage. We have had already occasion to remark that the statute of labourers had estranged the landowners from their peasants. The attempt to enforce the ancient dues of compulsory labour from the servile tenants had led to much bad blood. Everyone wished to hold his land at a moderate money rent, and not to be compelled to give forced labour for his lord's demesne farms. Wherever the owner of a manor insisted on carrying on the old system, discontent was rife. In many parts the peasantry had entered into secret clubs and combinations to resist their masters, and these societies seem to have had much to do with the organization of the rising. But this grievance alone does not suffice to explain the revolt. Its outbreak was as violent in Kent, where villenage no longer existed, as in any other shire. There was a bitter feeling abroad against the tyrannical forest laws, against the tolls and market dues which raised the price of provisions, against the whole tribe of lawyers whose subtleties and legal fictions were thought to prevent the poor man from obtaining justice. In some parts, too, the rising was strongly anti-clerical. It was very violent in places like St. Albans and Bury St. Edmunds, where the tenants of the church had tried in vain to get from their abbots the charters and privileges which most other small towns enjoyed. Very important also, although it has sometimes been exaggerated, was the influence of Wycliffe's denunciation of the clergy during the last 10 years. His teaching had filtered down to the lower strata of society in a form which took the shape of socialism. He had preached that obedience was not due to spiritual superiors of evil life, and that it was expedient that the Church should be deprived of the overgreat wealth which was corrupting her. He had founded an order of poor priests who went about the country spreading his doctrines, and in the mouths of his more fanatical disciples his teaching took an almost anarchical turn. They denounced all obedience to unrighteous governors, lay or clerical, and spoke as if poverty was the only virtue and riches the sole source of evil. The most violent language of this kind was used by a wandering priest named John Ball, who was well known all over the southern shires. He was not a Wycliffite, since he had been in trouble for his teaching long before Wycliffe's name had been heard outside Oxford, but his addresses pressed to their logical extreme all the ideas which underlay the new doctrine. His famous text, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" was the prelude to sermons urging that all men must be made equal, and all property forcibly divided into equal shares. For the most part, however, the men who joined in the revolt were not bent on setting the whole world to rights, but on getting rid each of his own special grievance. In June of 1381 the rising broke out in all the eastern counties from Kent as far as Yorkshire, with a simultaneity that shows that it must have been prepared beforehand. Whether the organization had been made by the secret societies of the labourers or by the travelling agitators is not certain, though we know that John Ball had held a meeting in London just before the rising with some of the men who afterwards led the revolt in Norfolk and Suffolk. The first riot broke out, it is said, at Dartford in Kent, where a certain tiller slew one of the collectors of the poll tax who had grossly insulted his daughter. Whatever may be the truth of this story, it is certain that all Kent rose in arms as if on a given signal, and a few days afterwards Essex and the eastern counties followed suit, June 1381. In all the regions over which the rising spread there was a certain amount of bloodshed and a good deal of plunder. The persons who were slain were mainly justices of the peace, lawyers, and officials connected with the levying of the poll tax. But local quarrels and grievances led to other murders, such as those of the prior of Bury St. Edmunds and the governor of Norwich Castle. Everywhere the manors of unpopular landlords were sacked, and manor rolls and records of taxation sought out and burnt. In Cambridge, where the town and the university had an old quarrel, the mob burst open the university church and burnt all the charters and muniments, crying, "Away with the learning of clerks, away with it." After a few days of uproar, the bands of the home counties began to move on London. Those of Kent, under a leader who called himself Wat Tyler, encamped on Blackheath, while the men of Hertfordshire took post at Highbury, and those of Essex at Hampstead. They all agreed in swearing that they were true to the king, and only desired to deliver him from his evil counsellors. The gates of London were shut against them by the mayor Walworth, but there was no other attempt to resist them, for the government had been taken by surprise and had no time to collect troops. But on June 12th the mob of the city rose and opened the gates to the insurgents. They spread themselves through the streets, not indulging in general plunder, but sacking and burning the Savoy, the palace of John of Gaunt, and slaying many foreign merchants and certain persons against whom they had special grievances. The young king, who had retired into the Tower, tried to parley with them. The demands which they sent him were not so wild as might have been expected. They asked for a free pardon, for the abolition of all villanage, for the removal of many taxes and tolls, and for a permission to all who had formerly held land on a servile tenure to become instead free tenants of their farms at the rent of 4d. an acre. It was evident that the majority had not been led away by the teaching of John Ball and his fellows. Seeing that their terms were not altogether impossible, the young king, who displayed admirable courage and coolness, though he was but 15 years of age, bade them meet him at Mile End, then a great open space, and there discuss their grievances. The majority came to the colloquy, but while it was going on, Wat Tyler and John Ball, with about 400 riotous followers, burst into the Tower, and there murdered the Archbishop Simon of Sudbury, who was specially hated as the framer of the poll tax, and with him Sir Robert Hales the treasurer, and John Legge the chief collector of the tax. While this dreadful scene was going on, the young king had been addressing the main body of the insurgents at Mile End. After some discussion he agreed to grant their demands, and 30 clerks were set at once to work to draw out charters granting free pardons and the abolition of villanage for the inhabitants of each town or 100. That evening the majority of the insurgents went quietly home, having, as they thought, obtained their desires, June 13th. But Tyler and many thousands of the rougher and wilder sort remained behind. Some of them were fanatics, and others were scenting more plunder and bloodshed. Next day the king summoned Tyler and his followers to meet him at Smithfield, trusting to make terms with them as he had with their fellows, but the insurgent chief had gone too far to feel himself safe, and was set on keeping up the tumult, lest he should be called to justice for the murders of Sudbury and Hales. He bore himself insolently at the meeting, and began wrangling and insulting the king's attendants. This so excited William Walworth, the mayor, that he drew a cutlass from under his gown and hewed down the rebel from his horse. Thereupon one of the king's squires ran in and struck him dead as he lay. Richard and his whole party was within an ace of perishing, for the multitude, seeing their leader fall, bent their bows and were about to let fly. But the courageous young king rode forward among them, crying that he himself would now be their leader, and would see that justice was done to them. They hesitated a moment, and then, won by his noble bearing, followed him to Islington, where in the open field he distributed to them charters like those which had been given to their fellows on the previous day. They then dispersed, and he was able to ride back to his mother, swearing that he had this day won back his heritage and the realm of England which was lost, June 14th. When the insurgents had gone home, the knights and nobles flocked into London, with thousands of armed retainers. The landholding classes were very wroth that their villeins had been freed without their consent, and said that Richard had given away what was not his own. In spite of the free pardon that had been granted, many scores of the leaders of the rebels in Kent and the home counties were seized and hung. Among them were John Ball and Jack Straw, who had been captain of the Essex men. In Norfolk the warlike Bishop Despenser took arms and put down the eastern insurgents, slaying their leader, the priest John Raw. A few months later Parliament met and voted that all the charters issued by the king were null and void, because they had been issued without the sanction of the two houses. Richard made some attempt to keep his promise to the insurgents, and tried to get his abolition of villenage confirmed, but the voice of Lords and Commons was given unanimously against him, and he had to yield. The only grace that he obtained was that in January 1382, on the occasion of his marriage to Anne of Bohemia, the young daughter of the Emperor Charles IV., a general amnesty was published for the surviving insurgents. But all their prominent leaders had already perished. Nevertheless, it must not be forgotten that in one way the rising had not been without successful results. The landowning classes had been so thoroughly frightened by the outbreak that they dealt more cautiously with the peasants for the future. For the next century villenage was silently disappearing, as the lords allowed their men to commute labour for money rents and to become free tenants. The grievances of villenage were never again the cause of insurrection, for they gradually disappeared. In the next century we shall see that the great popular rising of Jack Cade, which in many features recalls that of Wat Tyler, was political and not social in its aims and ends. Richard was now in his 16th year, and had shown that he possessed both courage, ready wit, and a heart that could sympathize with his subjects. But he was not allowed to assume control of the administration. All through his reign he was the victim of a tribe of ambitious uncles and cousins, who were determined to keep him in the background as much as possible. John of Gaunt was now not the only source of trouble. His youngest brother, Thomas of Woodstock, who had become Duke of Gloucester, was a far worse man, domineering, arrogant, selfish, and given to all manner of intrigues. He and Lancaster fell out, and their quarrels allowed the king some liberty, but in 1385 the elder duke disappeared for some time from the scene. By his marriage with Constance of Castile he had a claim on the inheritance of Pedro the Cruel, and in the hope of making himself a ruler in Spain he went overseas with all the followers he could raise. He allied himself with his son-in-law, the King of Portugal, and at first conquered many towns in the northern provinces of Castile. But his army wasted away, the Castilians hated the memory of Dom Pedro too much to submit to his heir, and after long struggles, 1385-89, John was to return to England disappointed and grown old before his time. During his absence Richard had reached the age of 20, and at last assumed the governance of his realm. His chosen ministers were Michael de la Pole and Robert de Weir, Earl of Oxford. The former was a man of a new family. His father had been a wealthy merchant of Hull, but he himself took to war and politics, rose to the front by his ability, and was now in his middle age made Chancellor and afterwards Earl of Suffolk. De Weir, on the other hand, held one of the oldest earldoms in England. He was a young man of the same age as the king, and had become his favourite companion. To raise him to a position above the rest of the barons, Richard made him Marquis of Dublin and Duke of Ireland. After these two friends, the king placed most confidence in his half-brothers, the sons of the Princess of Wales by her first marriage, Thomas Holland, Earl of Kent, and John Holland, who was afterwards made Earl of Huntingdon. De la Pole and de Weir could not in any sense be called favourites in the objectionable sense of the term. The experience of one and the ancient nobility of the other made them persons whom it was quite fitting that the king should choose as his ministers. It may be that Michael was somewhat avaricious, and Robert somewhat vain and light-headed, but we have only their enemies' word for the accusation. Their rule was certainly no worse than that of their predecessors. The plot which was made against them must accordingly be attributed to jealousy and ambition, and not to patriotism. Thomas of Gloucester, who was set on holding the chief power under his nephew the king, drew into a conspiracy certain discontented nobles, the chief of whom were the Earls of Arundel, Warwick, and Nottingham, and the young Henry of Bolingbroke, the eldest son of the Duke of Lancaster. In the Parliament of 1386, Gloucester and his friends made a great stir against the ministers, accusing them of embezzling the king's money, mismanaging the war with France, which still dragged on its weary length, and refusing to carry on the government according to the advice of the Council and the two Houses. De la Pole was impeached and declared guilty, although the accusations were wholly unfair. But the moment that the Parliament had dispersed, the king gave him his pardon and restored him to the office of Chancellor. This action of Richard's gave the conspirators the opportunity which they desired. At Gloucester's call they took arms and called out their retainers. Marching on London, they found no one to oppose them, and seized the town. They called themselves the Lords Appellant, because they appealed or accused of treason Suffolk, Oxford, and certain other of the king's advisers. Richard bade his followers take arms, and De Vere gathered some levies in the western counties. But at Radcot Bridge on the upper Thames, near Lechlade, he was beset by a far greater host which the insurgent barons had sent out against him. After a brief skirmish, the king's men surrendered, De Vere escaping with difficulty by swimming his horse across the river. He fled to France, where he was soon afterwards joined by De la Pole, who had also succeeded in getting away in safety from England. But the greater part of Richard's minor partisans did not leave the realm. They had not foreseen the merciless character of the Lords Appellant. Gloucester had determined to break the spirit of the king, and to deal so harshly with his instruments that no man should ever dare to serve him again. In February 1388 met the merciless Parliament, which was wholly dominated by the Lords Appellant, who had taken care to pack the Commons with their adherents. Gloucester behaved to his nephew with studied insolence. He brought out the documents which related to the deposition of Edward II, read them to the king before the assembly, and openly told him that there were good reasons for treating him as his great-grandfather had been treated. But for once he should be spared, and placed for the future in the hands of strong and wise counsellors. The Parliament then proceeded to impeach the king's ministers. Suffolk and Oxford had crossed the seas. So had Neville, Archbishop of York, who also was cited as an offender. But there were at hand Tressilian, the Chief Justice, Sir Simon Burley, an old friend of the Black Prince, who had been the king's tutor in his boyhood, and Nicholas Bramber, an ex-mayor of London, all prominent servants of the unfortunate Richard. After the mere mockery of a trial, Tressilian and Bramber were hung and Burley beheaded. 3 knights of the king's household, named Beauchamp, Berners, and Salisbury, were subsequently arrested, tried, and executed. The Parliament then voted liberal supplies for the expenses of government, from which the Lords Appellants were not ashamed to take £20,000 to compensate them for the trouble and expense to which they had been put. Finally, the king was made to renew his coronation oath before the Archbishop of Canterbury in St. Paul's Cathedral, and after assisting at the ceremony, the merciless Parliament dispersed. June 1388. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Richard II, 1388 to 1399. The Lords Appellant were very much deceived if they imagined that their coup d'état was likely to reduce King Richard to a permanent state of dependence. He was no coward or trifler, and devoted the whole of the rest of his life to an elaborate scheme of vengeance against the men who had slain his friends and inflicted such deep humiliation on himself. Warned of the strength of Gloucester's party by the events of 1388, he was resolved to spend years, if necessary, in preparing for a new struggle the next time he would have armed force at his back, and would not be caught unprepared. The government of the Lords Appellant lasted no more than a year. It was not more fortunate or capable than that which it had superseded, for Gloucester soon showed that he was an intriguer and not a statesman. Nor was he even consistent in his policy. Though he had always been an advocate of vigorous war with France, he now concluded a truce with the young Charles VI. France was at the time in a condition not unlike that of England, for Charles was a victim of a tribe of domineering uncles, who dealt with him in much the same way that Lancaster and Gloucester dealt with Richard II. He made no objection to the long-needed suspension of hostilities. In May 1389, King Richard found it possible to take the governance of the realm out of the hands of the Lords Appellants. He surprised those who were present at the council by suddenly asking his uncle, Gloucester, what was his own age. The Duke answered that he was now in his 23rd year. To this Richard replied that since he had so long passed his majority, he was old enough to govern his own realm, and that he would choose his own ministers. He formally thanked the Lords Appellants for their services, but said that he had no further need for them. If he had dared to recall his exiled friends, or to take open measures of vengeance against his oppressors, there is no doubt that civil war would have broken out. But Richard was now playing a very cautious game. He made his grandfather's old advisers his ministers. The good Bishop William of Wykeham became Chancellor, and Branningham of Exeter Treasurer, just as they had been in 1371. The Lords Appellants were not driven out of the council, but allowed to keep their seats, though they no longer dominated the whole body. Nothing was done to which any exception could be taken, so the malcontents had no opportunity of appealing to the country or rising in revolt. The next 8 years were by far the most fortunate and prosperous part of King Richard's reign. He governed well and wisely, and won golden opinions on every side. The most statesmanlike of all his measures was the conclusion of a permanent agreement with France. The two countries were to be at peace for 30 years, England retaining Calais and the district round Bordeaux and Bayonne, but surrendering her claim to her other lost possessions. The treaty was made firm by Richard's marriage to Isabella, the 8-year-old daughter of the French king. He had lately lost his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and so was free to wed again. But it was unwise to choose so young a bride, for he had no children by his first marriage, and an heir to the throne was much needed. As long as Richard was childless, his uncles and cousins were tempted to dream of ultimately succeeding to his crown. As a temporary measure of expediency, he recognized as heir apparent Roger, Earl of March, the grandson of Lionel of Clarence, the second son of Edward III. This action was very ill received by John of Gaunt and his son, the Earl of Derby, who had secret hopes of asserting the preference of the male to the female line of succession. Among the most prominent features of the middle years of Richard's reign was the growing importance of the Wycliffites, or Lollards, as they were now beginning to be called. The reaction which followed the peasant revolt had only checked their rise for a short time. The king himself neither identified himself with them, nor took any of the measures against them which the clergy endeavoured to press on him. His wife Anne had been distinctly favourable to them, and her foreign servants and followers took back to their native land the teachings of Wycliffe, which were destined to inspire John Huss, the great Bohemian reformer. Some of the baronage, among whom the Earl of Salisbury was the most prominent person, and a great number of the wealthier members of the citizen class, were open supporters of the Wycliffite movement. The trend of the times was in their favour, for the papacy was daily growing more scandalous. The great schism had now begun, and instead of one bad pope at Avignon, there were now two rival pontiffs, one at Avignon and one at Rome, who had excommunicated each other and were endeavouring to stir up the states of Europe to a general religious war. Wycliffe's teaching had now become doctrinal as well as political. In his old age he had preached against the invocation of saints, the superstitious adoration of relics and images, the spiritual efficacy of pilgrimages, and the real presence in the Eucharist. He persisted in his old denunciation of the over-great wealth of the clergy, and the influence of his followers in the Parliament is shown by their repeated attempts to introduce legislation confiscating monastic lands, and church endowments for the benefit of the state. Richard refused to countenance these proposals, but he was equally firm in refusing to allow the bishops to persecute the Lollards. Wycliffe has died in peace, 1384, after having accomplished his great work of translating the Bible into the English tongue. His followers in the next generation were destined to fall upon more troublous times. Among other characteristic instances of King Richard's wise and careful governance of his realm may be mentioned his endeavour to introduce better order into Ireland, which his predecessors had systematically neglected for 200 years. The English influence in the sister island had been greatly reduced during the reign of Edward II by the repeated invasions of Edward Bruce, who had drawn many of the native septs into rebellion. The Scots were finally driven out, but the havoc they had wrought was never repaired, and the area over which the king's authority reached was permanently decreased. Many of the tribal chiefs of the north fell off from their allegiance, and what was more dangerous still, many of the Anglo-Norman settlers drifted into close alliance with the rebels, adopting Celtic names, and became more Irish than the Irish themselves. The assimilation of the new and old inhabitants would have been advantageous both for themselves and for England if it had tended toward peace and union, but its sole effect was to increase tribal civil war and to diminish the central power of the government. Even the Pale, the district round Dublin, which had been most thickly colonized by the English, began to fall into disorder. It was in vain that in 1366 King Edward III caused the Statute of Kilkenny to be passed, forbidding the Anglo-Irish from mixing and marrying with the natives and adopting Celtic customs. Such laws can never be kept when the tendency of the times is against them, and the statute raised much bad blood between the settlers and the natives without having any permanent effect in restoring the power of the king. In 1394 Richard went over to Ireland to try the effect of his personal presence in setting the land in order. None of his predecessors since King John had visited it. His arrival was not without effect. Many of the native chiefs did him homage, and the lords of the Pale were for a space more obedient. He held a parliament of the whole land at Dublin, and then went home after appointing his heir apparent, Roger, Earl of March, Lord Deputy of the island. By 1396 Richard felt himself firmly established on the throne, and he knew that he was liked and trusted by the majority of the nation. He felt that it would be no longer possible for a few powerful barons to rise against him and crush him as they had in 1388. Accordingly, he thought that it was time for him to take in hand the punishment of his old enemies, the Lords Appellant. He had even gone to the pains of dividing them by showing special favour to Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, and Henry, Earl of Derby, the two who had been least implicated in the rising of 1388. His real enmity was directed against Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick. It must be confessed that the Duke gave his nephew every opportunity and provocation that he could have desired. He had intrigued against the French peace, insulted the king on his marriage, refused to keep the government of Ireland when it was given to him, and caused his partisans in Parliament to make many perverse and unnecessary complaints against Richard's household and ministers. It was even said that he was plotting a second rebellion with the object of again seizing supreme power. In 1397 Richard suddenly struck down his enemies. Warwick was arrested at a banquet, while Gloucester was captured by the king himself. He rode out to Plashy in Essex, the Duke's favourite residence, and personally laid hands on him, telling him that he should have the same mercy that he had shown to Burghley 9 years before. Arundel surrendered on promise of a fair trial before his peers. Richard then summoned a Parliament and announced his intention of trying his 3 prisoners for treason. Copying their own procedure in 1388, he had them appealed by a number of the barons of his own party. Among the new Lords Appellant were included the king's half-brothers, Kent and Huntingdon, Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, Edmund of York, Earl of Rutland, and Scroop, a kinsman of the exiled Suffolk. Arundel and Warwick were duly impeached before their peers, both for their old doings and for the new treason laid to their charge. Both were condemned, and Arundel was beheaded, but Warwick's sentence was commuted to imprisonment for life in the Isle of Man. Gloucester did not appear for trial, but his death was reported to the Parliament. It seems clear that Richard had him secretly put to death in his prison at Calais, because he was determined not to spare him, yet shrank from the idea of ordering the public execution of such a near kinsman. Thus the king had secured his long-deferred vengeance for the evil doings of the merciless Parliament. He could not, however, recall his exiled friends Suffolk and Oxford, since both of them had died some time back. During the 3 years which he had yet to reign, he did not delegate his authority to any ministers of such power and influence as de la Pole and de Vere, but carried out a purely personal government, using as his instruments men of no importance who could be trusted to obey his orders. The chief of them was Suffolk's kinsman Scroop, whom he made Earl of Wilts, and Bushy the Speaker of the House of Commons. In this last period of his reign Richard displayed distinctly unconstitutional tendencies, which gradually estranged from him the popular sympathy which he had gained by his good governance between 1389 and 1396. His conduct was not yet exactly tyrannical, but it made men fear that he might some day grow more violent. He raised some benevolences or forced loans from rich men whom he wished to keep in his dependence. He made persons whom he distrusted sign blank charters, which he could fill up at his pleasure with whatever terms he liked, if they should happen to displease him. Unlike the kings his predecessors, he always kept a large guard of archers about him. But most ominous of all was an innovation which he invented in the year 1398. He got Parliament to delegate its powers to a standing committee of 10 peers, 2 bishops, and 6 commoners, whose consent to a statute or a tax was to have the same power as a parliamentary vote of approval. This was a most dangerous device, for it was obviously easy for the king to dominate such a small body, and to wring from it the approval of things which the 2 houses themselves would not have been likely to grant. All these moves on Richard's part were menaces to the constitution, but he cannot be accused of having actually misgoverned the realm. He refrained from oppression because he hoped to keep the people on his side, but he had already made enemies of a large part of the baronage, and of the clergy whom he had refused to aid in their attempts to attack the Lollards. The mass of the nation was not yet estranged from him, but they were seriously disturbed by his recent autocratic tendencies. The actual cause of Richard's fall came from a matter of personal revenge. The 2 surviving Lords Appellant, Mowbray and Henry of Lancaster, fell into a quarrel, and accused each other of treason. Richard allowed them to challenge each other to a judicial duel, but when they appeared to fight it out in the lists at Coventry, he suddenly declared that the combat should not proceed, but that both should be banished the realm, Mowbray for life, Henry of Lancaster for 10 years. This was regarded as a very hard decision, for one of the 2 must surely have been in the right. But there can be little doubt that Richard was merely carrying out to its final stage his vengeance for the acts of 1388. He had now punished all the murderers of Burghley and Tressilian, 1398. A year later John of Gaunt died at the age of 61. The vast Lancaster estates and the ducal title fell to his banished son, but Richard very unjustly refused to hand them over to him, or to allow him to draw their revenues, taking them into his own possession. As Henry had not been declared a traitor or properly convicted of any misdoing, There was obviously no justification for this action. It turned the exile into an open enemy who was determined to risk anything to get revenge. In 1399 his opportunity came. The Earl of March, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, was slain in a skirmish by Irish rebels, and Richard hastily crossed to Ireland to restore order. He was engaged in a difficult campaign against the Wicklow Mountains when he received the surprising news that Henry of Lancaster had landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, having in his company Archbishop Arundel, the brother of the deceased Lord Appellant, and a few other exiles. He proclaimed that he had only come to sue for his Duchy of Lancaster, and had no treasonable designs. July 1399. He was soon joined by thousands of the retainers of his father and by many of the northern barons. The charge of the realm had been given, during the king's absence, to Edmund, Duke of York, Richard's last surviving uncle, a simple and unenterprising old man. He gathered an army together, but foolishly disbanded it when Lancaster vowed that he had no treasonable design, and only wished to appeal to a free Parliament and to drive away evil counsellors from the king. Thus Henry found himself unopposed, and had the realm at his feet, for Richard was detained at Dublin by persistent easterly winds, which prevented him from crossing the Irish Channel. He soon showed the bent of his plans by seizing and executing without fair trial the king's chief ministers, Scroop, Earl of Wiltshire, Bushy, and Green. This roused some of Richard's faithful adherents to take arms, and the Earl of Salisbury got together an army in Wales to meet his master on his expected arrival. But by an unlucky chance the weather still kept Richard storm-bound in Ireland, and he only reached Milford Haven 2 days after Salisbury's host had disbanded itself and gone home in despair. The king had arrived almost alone, trusting to find his friends in arms and ready to aid him. He was soon surrounded by a force which Lancaster had sent against him, under Percy, Earl of Northumberland. On a false assurance sworn by the Earl that nothing treasonable was designed against his crown or person, Richard surrendered himself. He was at once hurried up to London, where a Parliament had been hastily called together. Having now got his cousin into his hands, Henry showed that he aimed not at changing the ministry, but at seizing the throne. The Parliament voted that Richard had forfeited his crown by breaking his coronation oath and governing unrighteously. On 33 separate charges, some of them absurd, and all couched in exaggerated language, he was declared to have deserved deposition. Richard, much broken in spirit, yielded and consented to abdicate, whereupon his cousin stepped forward and laid claim to the crown. The deposed monarch was sent to Pontefract Castle, which he was never to leave alive. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Henry IV, 1399 to 1413. Down to the moment of his accession, Henry of Lancaster had been aided by an extraordinary series of chances. The king's absence in Ireland, the feeble action of the Duke of York, the prolonged easterly winds which had kept Richard from returning to England, the supineness shown by his chief partisans, were circumstances on which Henry could not have counted when he landed at Ravenspur. If events had fallen out otherwise, it is probable that he would not have dared to seize the throne, but would have stopped short at his original programme of claiming justice for himself. But the moment that the usurpation was complete, the inherent weakness of the new ruler's position began to display itself. He was, in reality, no more than the king of a party. His only true supporters were the baronial faction, which had been attached to the Lords Appellant and the churchmen, headed by Archbishop Arundel, who had resolved to make him their instrument for the suppression of the Wycliffites. the support of other partisans could only be bought by encouraging a lively sense of favours to come. Meanwhile, the deposed king had also a powerful baronial faction adhering to him, though for the moment it seemed crushed, and there were many parts of the country where his name was far more popular than that of Henry. The House of Lancaster's claim to the crown was in truth dependent solely on the election by Parliament. In strict hereditary right, the deposition of Richard II made the young Earl of March, son of the Roger of March who fell in Ireland in 1398, heir to the throne. By setting him aside, Henry committed himself to the theory of popular election to the crown, and he had therefore always to remember that Parliament might unmake him even as it had made him. Hence the most prominent characteristic of his domestic policy was a determination to keep the two houses in good temper at all costs, a line of conduct which often led him into a subservience to them which earlier kings would have regarded as degrading. Besides managing Parliament, Henry had to keep together the baronial party which supported him, and to grant the churchmen all that they asked. Henry had been popular as Earl of Derby, but as king he found that he had no enthusiastic support from the nation. His enemies were many and active, his true friends were few, his interested supporters were greedy but lukewarm, while the bulk of the people cared little for him. It is a great proof of his ability that for 14 years he kept tight hold on the crown, and finally passed it on to his son. His character was well suited for the task that he had undertaken. Though unscrupulous, he was plausible, soft-spoken, and courteous. A proud or hot-tempered man would have ruined himself in a few years. But Henry was pliable, cautious, and wary, though when needful he could strike hard blows without hesitation. He had only been 2 months on the throne when the first of the many rebellions with which he was to be plagued broke out. The leaders were, as might have been expected, the partisans of the late king, Richard's half-brother John Holland, Earl of Huntingdon, his nephew Thomas Holland, Earl of Kent, Montague, Earl of Salisbury, the best known of the Lollards, and Lord Despencer. Under cover of a tournament they collected several thousand armed men and suddenly marched on Windsor, intending to catch the king unawares. Henry escaped by a lucky chance. He had only half an hour to spare, and fled to London, where he summoned the citizens to arms. The Hollands and their friends, finding that their first blow had failed, resolved to disperse in order to gather together greater forces. The main body began to retire westward, where they hoped to raise the numerous friends of King Richard in Wales and the Welsh border. This delay was their ruin. The king pursued them in haste, and they broke up without a pitched battle. Kent and Salisbury were slain in a skirmish at Cirencester. Huntingdon was caught and beheaded in Essex. Despencer at Bristol, both without any form of trial. 4 minor chiefs were hung, drawn, and quartered in London, December 1399 to January 1400. This ill-concerted rebellion caused the death of the unfortunate King Richard. To prevent further rebellion in his behalf, Henry secretly caused him to be starved to death in Pontefract Castle. His agony is said to have endured 15 days, January, February 1400. His corpse was publicly exposed, but the mystery of his death caused some people to believe that the body shown was not his, and for many years after rumours of his survival were current. An impostor who took his name lived all through Henry's reign at the court of Scotland. The main event of note in the following year marks Henry's anxiety to secure his unsteady throne by giving guarantees for his fidelity to the Church party. At the suggestion of Archbishop Arundel, he induced the Parliament to pass the infamous statute De Heretico Comberendo, which condemned to death by fire convicted heretics. No delay was made in commencing the persecution of the Lollards, and before a month was out they counted their first martyr, William Sawtrey, a chaplain of London, who was burnt after steadfastly refusing to recant, February 1401. The persecution went on intermittently for the next 20 years. Though they obliged the king by countenancing his assault on the followers of Wycliffe, the Parliament took a very high tone with him in dealing with legislation and finance. They endeavoured to bind him down in the matter of expenses, and repeatedly propounded to him a theory that no grants of money ought to be made to the crown till all grievances petitioned against by the houses had been previously redressed. Henry temporized and procrastinated, putting off the evil day when he might be obliged to make this great constitutional concession. Richard's death had some temporary effect in checking rebellions, for it was difficult to make the child Edmund of March the head of a political cause, and to gather a party round his name. Moreover, the long uncertainty as to the deposed king's death kept men from recognizing his heir. The next troubles which Henry had to face were connected not with plots to change the English succession, but with a national rebellion in Wales. For a full century the principality had been undisturbed by civil strife, and Welsh troops had served Edward III faithfully in all his wars. But now a chief of genius arose in the person of Owain Glendour, or Glendower as the English called him, who descended from the old kings of Gwynedd. His countrymen had never been partisans of Lancaster, and readily took arms when he called on them to resist the usurper. Owen made some pretence of rising in Richard's behalf, but he was really fighting for his own hand to restore Welsh independence. The rebellion was national and had nothing to do with English dynastic matters. When Glendower descended from his hills, it was not to rally partisans in England, but to ravage the border shires up to the gates of Shrewsbury and Worcester. Henry sent army after army against the rebels, but he could never catch them. They retired to the mountains till the invader's food was exhausted, and turned to harass his rear guard when he departed. When a larger expedition, led by the king himself, marched into Wales, it met with such bad weather and suffered so severely that the English complained that Owen was a wizard and had leagued himself with the powers of the air to discomfit his foes. 1402. The Welsh rebellion gave no signs of spreading into England, but other troubles arose to touch Henry more nearly. The French king, armed to avenge his dethroned son-in-law, and threatened invasion. Norman privateers ravaged many of the towns of the southern coast. At the same time, the Scots, under the Earl of Douglas, crossed the border and advanced into England. They suffered, however, a crushing defeat on Homildon Hill at the hands of Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland, and Douglas himself was taken prisoner with many other Scottish nobles, 14th of September, 1402. This victory, however, was destined to have dangerous consequences. The king demanded that the captives should be made over to him, since he was desirous of filling his depleted exchequer with their ransoms. But the Percys had looked upon the money as their own, and bitterly resented the order. Northumberland had been Henry's chief supporter at his usurpation, and thought that nothing could be denied him. When peremptorily summoned to obey, he resolved to refuse, and hastily planned a rebellion, for his power was so great in the north that he could put into the field a whole army of his own retainers. The rising was a mere outburst of feudal anarchy, the Percy clan being its sole authors. Northumberland placed his gallant and reckless son Henry, whom people called Hotspur, at the head of his followers. He released his prisoner Douglas, who consented to espouse his cause, and he called in his brother Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester, to his aid. They sent messengers to Owen Glendower to secure his cooperation, and resolved to use the name of the little Earl of March to cover their rebellion. They then formally defied Henry, and declared him a perjured usurper and the murderer of his rightful king. The elder Percy remained in Yorkshire to watch the loyalists of the north, who had taken arms under Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, the head of a family which had been the local rivals of the Percys. His son Henry, Hotspur, and the Earls of Worcester and Douglas marched into Cheshire, a district always devoted to Richard II., and then pressed towards Shrewsbury, where Glendower and the Welsh were to join them. The king, however, marching hastily from London with a small army, threw himself between the Percys and Wales, and brought them to action at Hatley Field, 2 miles outside Shrewsbury. After a fierce battle, Hotspur was slain, and his uncle and Douglas captured. Worcester was immediately beheaded. He deserved no better fate, as he had been one of those who betrayed Richard II, and had received more than £30,000 in gifts from the usurper against whom he now had taken arms, July 21st, 1403. Northumberland, hearing that his son was dead, made abject professions of repentance, and was admitted to mercy on promising to surrender his numerous castles in the north. Less than 2 years of comparative quiet followed the king's victory at Shrewsbury. Owen Glendower still held his own in Wales, but England was for a short time at peace. But in 1405 troubles began again. Henry's suspicions were first roused by an attempt to steal away the young Earl of March from Windsor, where he was kept in safe custody. Soon after, insurrection again broke out in the north. It was directed by 2 leaders who had hereditary grudges against the king. Richard Scroop, Archbishop of York, was the brother of that Scroop, Earl of Wilts, who had been beheaded at Bristol in 1399. Thomas Mowbray, the Earl Marshal, was the son of the Mowbray whom Henry had accused of treason in 1398 and had faced in the lists of Coventry. His father had died in exile, and the son became a bitter enemy of the House of Lancaster. Scroop and Mowbray raised a force at York, and seeing rebellion afoot, the old Earl of Northumberland took arms in his own county to aid them. All 3 leaders agreed to recognize Edmund of March as king. But Henry's fortune was still strong. His lieutenant, the Earl of Westmoreland, broke the back of the rising by capturing the Archbishop, and the Earl Marshal by a villainous piece of ill faith. Having invited them to meet him under a flag of truce, he seized them when they came to the conference and put them in chains. Henry hurried northward, and on his arrival at York ordered both the prisoners to be executed. They received no trial before their peers, but were hurriedly condemned by an extemporized court and beheaded an hour after, June 8th, 1405. The death of Scroop caused widespread horror and dismay. No archbishop save Becket had ever been put to death for withstanding his king, and the northern clergy and people saluted Scroop as a martyr. Henry fell grievously ill a few days after, and was never a hale man for the rest of his life. The epileptic fits and leprosy which gradually grew upon him were universally regarded as heaven's vengeance for the archbishop's cruel end. But meanwhile the cause of rebellion did not prosper. The king's artillery blew Northumberland's castles to pieces in a few discharges, and the old earl had to flee into Scotland, where he lurked for 3 years, waiting for another opportunity for a blow at his enemy. Before it came, other troubles had been vexing Henry. His parliaments, with which he dared not quarrel, had learnt to treat him with scant respect. In 1406 they demanded and obtained from him the right to audit his accounts, and made him cut down the expenses of his household. In 1407 he had to acknowledge that the Commons had the sole right of initiating money grants. He was also made to promise to do nothing without first taking advice of his council. The weakness of his position is best understood by the fact that he allowed Parliament to deal with him in such a manner. No king whose throne was safe would have tolerated such interference. In 1407 the foreign relations of the crown slightly improved. The danger of invasion from France had hitherto been very real. Twice great French fleets had been collected in the Channel, and though they had not landed an army on the coast of Kent, yet flying squadrons had sacked many south country ports, and once a considerable body of troops had been sent to aid Glendower in Wales. The soul of the opposition to Henry IV had been Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, but in November 1407 he was murdered by the secret contrivance of his cousin, the Duke of Burgundy. His death was the cause of the outbreak of a long civil war between the party of nobles who had previously followed him and the partisans of Burgundy. Engrossed in domestic quarrels, the French had no longer any desire to dream of invading England. Their king, Charles VI., was utterly unable to keep his realm together, for he had become subject to fits of melancholy madness, which came on him every summer, and often disabled him for 4 and 5 months at a time. Soon, instead of France dreaming of molesting England, it was England which thought of interfering in faction-ridden France. In 1408, Henry was able to suppress the last of the many insurrections which were raised against him. The old Earl of Northumberland, Lord Bardolph, and the Welsh Bishop of Bangor slipped over the border and raised a considerable force, but they were met and crushed at the Battle of Bramham Moor by Sir Thomas Rokeby, Sheriff of Yorkshire. Both the rebel peers were slain. This was the last trouble which came from the direction of Scotland, where King Henry had of late secured much influence over the government. For King Robert's son and heir, Prince James, was taken at sea as he was crossing to France, 1406, and the Duke of Albany, who ruled in his brother's behalf and wished to keep all the power for himself, made a secret agreement by which Henry undertook to hold the young prince a captive, while the Duke covenanted in return not to molest England. Thus Henry was freed from the danger on the side both of France and Scotland, and had only the Welsh rebellion left on his hands. But he had fallen into wretched health, and from 1409 to 1411 was almost a chronic invalid. Most of the functions of government were discharged for him by his promising young son, Henry of Monmouth, the Prince of Wales. When only a boy, he had fought at his father's side at Shrewsbury, and in Wales, now as a young man of 20, he was already a hard-working statesman and soldier. There seems little room in his busy life for those curious tales of youthful riot and debauchery, and consorting with disreputable companions, which popular tradition associated with his name, and which the genius of Shakespeare has immortalized. The greater part of Henry's time was spent in hard soldiering in Wales, where he was constantly chasing Glendower's rebel bands, at first with small success. But as the years rolled on, the final triumph of the great guerrilla chief grew less and less probable, since the House of Lancaster was growing more firmly established in England. At last his followers began to desert him, and Prince Henry was able to pacify the greater part of the country, though down to the day of his death Glendower was never wholly subdued. It is in the end of the period of Henry of Monmouth's administration in behalf of his father, September through December 1411, that the first English interference in France since the Peace of 1393 falls. The quarrel of the Burgundian and Orleanist factions being at its height, Henry intervened in behalf of the former and sent a small force across the Channel, which helped the Burgundians to a victory over their enemies at St. Cloud. But this policy was not destined to be carried any further. In 1412 the king's health grew better for a short time, and he was able to take a greater share in public business. He seems to have somewhat resented the way in which his eldest son had monopolized the conduct of affairs during his illness, and showed his displeasure by relegating the Prince of Wales to the background for a time, and employing his second son, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, as his chief deputy and agent. In consequence of this change in policy, peace was made with the faction of Orleans, or the Armagnac, as they were called, from their new leader, Bernard, Count of Armagnac, who had taken the murdered duke's place. Shortly after, King Henry was once more smitten down with his old disease, and died rather suddenly at Westminster on March 20th, 1413, after having been reconciled to his eldest son. After all his troubles and dangers, he expired just as his throne seemed at last secure. But though he had rooted in his dynasty, his reign had not been a success. He left the country poorer than he had found it, civil war had been incessant, the central government was weak, the baronage and nation divided, and the blood feuds had been started that were to last for 3 generations and to end in the terrible Wars of the Roses. End of Chapter 9.